A longship emerges from the morning mist, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the grey waters. Bearded warriors with horned helmets raise their axes, preparing to descend upon an unsuspecting monastery. Blood will soon stain the sacred stones as the pagans pillage, gold and slaughter monks in a frenzy of violence. This is the Viking of popular imagination, a one-dimensional barbarian bent on destruction. But how much of this familiar image reflects historical reality? The answer might surprise you. The horned helmets. Pure invention, created for a 19th century production of Wagner's Ring Cycle. No authentic Viking helmet has ever been found with horns. The berserker rage? Exaggerated, mindless violence. A simplification that obscures a complex culture of traders, craftspeople, farmers, poets and explorers who operated within sophisticated social and legal frameworks. The real Viking Age was a time of remarkable achievement and transformation. Between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries, Scandinavian sailors, merchants and warriors ventured across vast distances, from North America to the Middle East, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. They established trade networks spanning continents, founded cities, influenced languages, transformed political structures, and connected isolated regions into an intercontinental web of exchange. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades have dramatically reshaped our understanding of the Norse world. Excavations at urban centres like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark reveal sophisticated trading hubs where merchants from across Europe, the Middle East and Asia exchange goods and ideas. Analyses of Viking burials show evidence of cultural exchange, religious complexity, and social stratification far beyond the simple raider stereotype. Genetic studies trace the movement and mixing of populations, revealing nuanced patterns of migration, settlement, and integration. The Vikings were not a unified people with a single identity. They came from what are now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, distinct kingdoms with different cultures, dialects, and patterns of expansion. They were not even called Vikings in their own time. The term Vikinger in Old Norse referred specifically to those who went on expeditions, usually for raiding. Many Scandinavians of the era never raided at all, remaining farmers, craftspeople, or local traders. Who were these people who burst onto the European stage with such dramatic impact? What drove them to leave their northern homelands and risk perilous journeys across open seas? How did they navigate thousands of miles without compasses or charts? What beliefs guided their worldview before Christianity? How did relatively small groups manage to exert such disproportionate influence across multiple continents? As we journey through the Viking Age, we'll explore not just what happened, but why, examining the environmental, technological, political, and cultural factors that converge to create this remarkable chapter in human history. We'll separate myth from reality, propaganda from evidence, and modern projection from historical truth. In doing so, we'll discover a society far more nuanced, sophisticated, and influential than the caricature that has dominated popular culture for centuries. Long before the first recorded Viking raid, Scandinavia was undergoing profound changes. The migration period, 400 to 550 CE, had reshaped Europe as Germanic peoples moved across the continent, fleeing the advancing Huns or seeking new lands. While much of Europe experienced this tumult directly, Scandinavia remained somewhat insulated, developing distinctive cultural patterns that would later fuel its explosive outward expansion. Archaeological evidence from pre-Viking Scandinavia reveals a society already organising into hierarchical structures. At Upokra in southern Sweden, excavations have uncovered a settlement continuously occupied for over a millennium before the Viking Age. This proto-urban centre featured a ceremonial building rebuilt in the same location for generations, suggesting established religious practices and political continuity. Similar sites at Gudme in Denmark and Helgo in Sweden show concentrations of wealth and specialised craft production centuries before the first Viking raids. These early centres weren't yet true towns, but served as seasonal gathering places where regional elites could display their status, conduct trade, settle disputes, and perform religious ceremonies. Magnificent gold bracteates, medallions, and finely crafted jewellery from these sites demonstrate sophisticated metalworking traditions that would later be applied to the distinctive Viking art styles. Could these pre-Viking settlements, with their evidence of social stratification and craft specialisation, have been incubating the complex society that would later expand across continents? Recent archaeological finds suggest exactly that. The Viking phenomenon didn't emerge from nowhere, but evolved from increasingly sophisticated Scandinavian cultures of the 6th and 7th centuries. The social structure of pre-Viking Scandinavia centred around the institution of chieftaincy. Society was divided into 3 broad classes: jarls, aristocrats; carls, free farmers; and thralls, slaves. Chieftains derived their power from a combination of inherited status, wealth, and most importantly, their ability to attract and maintain followers through generosity and success in war. The hall was the centre of social and political life, a place where chieftains displayed their wealth through feasting and gift-giving. These wooden structures, like the one excavated at Borg in northern Norway, measuring over 80 metres long, served as stages for the complex reciprocal relationships that bound leaders to followers. A successful chieftain needed to be both a warrior and a provider of wealth to his retinue, creating pressure to acquire resources that could be redistributed. This gift economy, where status came from giving rather than accumulating wealth, would later fuel Viking raiding and trading. When chieftains needed more silver, gold, and luxury goods to maintain their position, they looked beyond their borders. Even before the Viking Age proper, Scandinavians were not isolated from European developments. Archaeological evidence shows extensive trade connections with the continent and British Isles. Roman coins, glass vessels, and other luxury items have been found throughout Scandinavia, demonstrating long-distance exchange networks. The magnificent ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England, likely of an East Anglian king with Swedish connections, shows the complex interrelationships between Scandinavia and Britain in the 7th century. By the 8th century, trading centres were developing along the Baltic and North Sea coasts. Ribe in Denmark, founded around 700 CE, shows evidence of craft specialisation, long-distance trade, and permanent settlement. Decades before the first recorded Viking raids, these emerging market towns created networks of exchange and knowledge that would later facilitate Viking expansion. Perhaps the most crucial pre-Viking development was in shipbuilding technology. The transition from rowing vessels to sailing ships represented a technological revolution that made the Viking Age possible. The earliest evidence for Scandinavian sailing vessels dates to around 700 CE, just before the first raids. The Kvalsund ship, found in Norway and dating to around 700 CE, shows intermediate features between rowing vessels and true Viking ships. What made Viking ships exceptional was their unique combination of features: clinker-built hulls with overlapping planks for flexibility in rough seas, shallow drafts allowing navigation in rivers and beach landings, symmetrical designs permitting forward or backward movement without turning, and a keel-to-length ratio that provided both stability and speed. These vessels were lightweight enough to be portaged between waterways, yet strong enough to withstand ocean voyages. This maritime technology didn't appear overnight. It evolved through centuries of refinement, as Scandinavians adapted to their environment of fjords, islands, and inland waterways. By the late 8th century, these ships had developed into the most advanced naval technology in Europe, a crucial advantage that would allow Vikings to strike quickly, navigate rivers deep into continental interiors, and establish trade routes spanning thousands of miles. As the 8th century progressed, population pressure, climate fluctuations, and political consolidation created conditions ripe for expansion. When opportunity presented itself in the form of wealthy, poorly defended religious centres abroad, Scandinavians had both the means and motivation to strike. The storm was gathering. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. So wrote the Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin in 793 CE, reacting to the shocking news that had reached the court of Charlemagne. The holy island of Lindisfarne, off England's northeastern coast, had been attacked by seaborne raiders from the north. The date, June 8th, 793, would later be marked as the conventional beginning of the Viking Age. Lindisfarne was no ordinary target. Founded by the Irish monk Aidan in 635 CE, it had become one of the most sacred sites in the Christian Anglo-Saxon world, famous for its illuminated manuscripts and as the cult centre of St. Cuthbert. The psychological impact of this attack was profound. If God would not protect even his most devoted servants, what hope did ordinary communities have? The raid itself was brutally efficient. Arriving in their swift longships, the Scandinavian warriors struck without warning on a summer morning. The monastery's wealth, accumulated over generations in the form of gold and silver religious objects, manuscripts with jewelled covers, and stored food supplies, was defenceless. The monks committed to non-violence could offer little resistance as the raiders killed some, took others as slaves, and stripped the sanctuary of its treasures. What made the Lindisfarne raid particularly shocking was not just its target, but its execution. Unlike land-based armies that could be tracked and intercepted, these seaborne raiders appeared seemingly from nowhere, struck quickly, and vanished back to sea before local forces could respond. This tactical advantage would define Viking raiding for generations. Contrary to popular belief, Lindisfarne wasn't actually the first Viking raid on Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 789 CE, 3 ships of Northmen landed at Portland in Dorset, where they killed a royal official who mistook them for merchants. Archaeological evidence suggests even earlier, unrecorded raids. What made Lindisfarne different was its symbolic significance and the written records it generated. Following Lindisfarne, the pattern of Viking raiding quickly established itself. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked. In 795, the sacred islands of Iona, Skye, and Rathlin off Scotland and Ireland were raided. By 800, Viking ships were appearing regularly along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. These early raids followed a consistent pattern: quick strikes against wealthy, poorly defended targets, primarily churches and monasteries, followed by immediate withdrawal to the sea. The raiders operated in small groups with just a few ships, suggesting independent operators rather than royal fleets. They focused on portable wealth, gold, silver, and captives for the slave trade, rather than land acquisition. European responses to these early raids were disorganised and ineffective. Political fragmentation meant there was no coordinated defence strategy. Local forces were rarely able to mobilise quickly enough to intercept the raiders. Coastal warning systems and fortifications were minimal or non-existent. The psychological shock of these attacks, especially against sacred sites, created an atmosphere of terror disproportionate to the actual military threat. Contemporary Christian writers interpreted the Viking raids as divine punishment for sins. Alcuin explicitly connected the Lindisfarne attack to moral failings. Consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard of evil was merited by some unheard of evil practice. This theological interpretation shaped how the raids were recorded, emphasising their brutality and portraying the Vikings as instruments of God's wrath. But what drove these Scandinavians to suddenly strike outward in the late 8th century? The question continues to generate debate among historians, but several interconnected factors likely contributed to this dramatic expansion. Climate change may have played a significant role. The Viking Age coincided with the medieval warm period, which made farming more productive in Scandinavia, potentially supporting population growth that created pressure for expansion. However, climate fluctuations also brought periods of hardship, possibly pushing some to seek wealth abroad when local resources became strained. Population pressure in parts of Scandinavia, particularly western Norway, with its limited arable land, created incentives for young men to seek fortunes elsewhere. Inheritance customs that favoured eldest sons left many younger men without land, forming a pool of potential raiders and settlers. Political consolidation was beginning in Scandinavia as ambitious chieftains worked to expand their power. This competition created both push factors, defeated rivals seeking new territories, and pull factors, successful leaders needing wealth to reward followers. Perhaps most significantly, opportunity aligned with capability. Scandinavian shipbuilding technology had reached a point where long-distance raiding became feasible, just as Western European wealth was increasingly concentrated in vulnerable ecclesiastical centres. The fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire after his death in 814 created additional political instability that Vikings would exploit. Knowledge of wealthy, poorly defended targets spread quickly through Scandinavian networks. The success of early raiders inspired imitators, creating a snowball effect as more chieftains organised expeditions. What began as small-scale raiding would soon evolve into something far more ambitious. While raiders were making their first tentative strikes abroad, the vast majority of Scandinavians remained at home, continuing lives centred around farming, fishing, and local trade. To understand the Viking phenomenon fully, we must look beyond the dramatic raids to examine the society that produced these explorers, traders, and warriors. The typical Scandinavian landscape was one of scattered farmsteads rather than villages. Archaeological excavations at sites like Borg in Norway, Vorbass in Denmark, and Gien in Sweden reveal farmhouses that combined living quarters for the family with space for livestock under a single roof, a practical arrangement for the long northern winters. These longhouses, constructed of timber with thatched roofs, typically ranged from 15 to 30 metres in length, with the largest reaching over 80 metres at chieftain estates. Inside these dwellings, life centred around the central hearth, which provided both warmth and light during the long winter nights. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, often covered with furs. Loom weights found in many excavations indicate that textile production was an ongoing household activity. Cooking was done in iron cauldrons suspended over the fire or in clay pots. Meals typically consisted of porridge, bread, dairy products, preserved meat and fish, supplemented with seasonal vegetables, fruits and nuts. What might surprise modern observers is the relative cleanliness of Viking dwellings compared to later medieval standards. Combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and other grooming implements are common archaeological finds suggesting attention to personal hygiene. The Norse even had a dedicated bathing day, Saturday, or Laugardaga, washing day, which survives in modern Scandinavian words for Saturday. The archaeological record reveals a society with clear gender roles, yet one that afforded women significant rights and responsibilities compared to much of contemporary Europe. This paradox of Viking gender relations continues to fascinate historians. How could a warrior society also grant women legal powers that wouldn't become common elsewhere in Europe until centuries later? Women managed the household economy, which encompassed not just cooking and childcare, but also dairy production, textile manufacturing, food preservation, and often brewing, all critical economic activities. The keys hanging at a woman's belt symbolised her authority over household resources. In wealthy households, women directed the work of servants and slaves. Legally, Norse women could own property, inherit, initiate divorce under certain conditions, and reclaim their dowries if marriage is ended. They could conduct business and represent themselves in legal proceedings. The Icelandic sagas, though recorded later, depict women exercising considerable influence, sometimes goading male relatives to action to uphold family honour. While men dominated public and political spheres, women's domestic authority was substantial and recognised. This division reflected practical realities in a society where men were frequently absent on trading, raiding, or fishing expeditions. women needed legal and economic autonomy to manage affairs in their absence. Evidence for female warriors, a topic of intense debate, remains limited but intriguing. The controversial Birka warrior grave in Sweden, containing a body biologically female but buried with full warrior equipment, suggests that at least occasionally women might have taken on martial roles. However, such cases appear exceptional rather than normative. Family structure in Viking Age Scandinavia was based on the extended household rather than the nuclear family. Multiple generations lived together, often along with non-related workers and slaves. Kinship was paramount, with family connections determining one's place in society, legal protections, and obligations. Children entered adult roles early by modern standards. Girls learned household management and crafts from their mothers and other female relatives. Boys began training in weapons from young ages, while also learning farming, fishing, or craft skills. By their early teens, many young men would join trading or raiding expeditions as part of their transition to adulthood. The Scandinavian economy combined agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, and specialized crafts. In coastal regions, fishing provided crucial protein sources, while inland areas relied more heavily on livestock. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses were the primary domestic animals, valued for meat, milk, wool, transportation, and as status symbols. Farming techniques remained relatively simple, using wooden yards, primitive ploughs, rather than heavy ploughs, limiting agricultural productivity. The short growing season in northern regions created vulnerability to crop failures, which might have contributed to raiding as a supplementary economic activity. Craft specialization had advanced significantly by the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated metalworking, wood carving, jewelry making, shipbuilding, and textile production. Many crafts had spiritual or magical associations. Smiths, for instance, were often regarded with a mixture of respect and suspicion due to their transformative skills. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Norse society was its approach to law and governance. Unlike much of contemporary Europe, Scandinavia had no central authority imposing law from above. Instead, law was conceived as something discovered rather than created, an existing reality to be found through consensus and tradition. The primary institution for legal and political matters was the thing, an assembly of freemen who gathered periodically to resolve disputes, make communal decisions, and occasionally select kings. The thing met at established outdoor locations, often marked by standing stones or distinctive natural features. Major assemblies like the Althing in Iceland could draw participants from hundreds of miles around. At these assemblies, legal specialists called law speakers would recite the law from memory. As Norse society was primarily oral before the adoption of Christianity brought wider literacy. Disputes were resolved through a combination of witness testimony, oath-taking, and sometimes ordeal by fire or water. The emphasis was on compensation rather than punishment. Even killings were typically settled through carefully calculated payments to the victim's family rather than execution of the perpetrator. This system created a society that, while violent by modern standards, operated within sophisticated legal frameworks that prevented blood feuds from escalating indefinitely. Honour was paramount, but so was the pragmatic need to maintain social cohesion in small communities where everyone depended on mutual cooperation for survival. The thing system also limited the power of early Scandinavian kings, who were more first among equals than absolute rulers. Royal authority depended on personal charisma, military success, and the ability to dispense wealth to followers. Kings needed regular approval from thing assemblies, creating a check on power that would gradually erode as the Viking Age progressed and monarchies consolidated their authority. This legal tradition would have profound influence wherever Vikings settled, contributing elements to English common law and establishing one of the world's oldest parliamentary traditions in Iceland. The balance between individual rights and communal obligations, the emphasis on public proceedings, and the concept of law as discovered rather than imposed would shape legal development across northern Europe. If one innovation defined the Viking Age, it was the longship, a vessel so perfectly adapted to its purposes that it transformed Scandinavian raiders from coastal nuisances into a hemispheric force. What made these ships revolutionary wasn't any single feature, but their unique combination of characteristics, creating the most versatile seafaring technology of the early medieval world. The construction of a Viking ship began with the selection of oak trees, ideally those naturally curved to form the stems and ribs. Using axes, adzes and augers, shipwrights split planks radially from logs, following the grain to create stronger boards than would be possible with sawn timber. These planks were then overlapped in clinker, or lapstrake construction, with each plank fastened to the next by iron rivets, creating a flexible hull that could twist slightly in heavy seas without breaking. The keel, a massive timber running the length of the vessel, provided longitudinal strength, while still allowing the shallow draft necessary for beach landings and river navigation. Crossbeams tied the sides together and supported decking, while an ingenious system of wooden pegs rather than rigid nails connected the ribs to the hull planking, allowing the ship to flex as a unified structure in rough waters. This flexibility proved crucial for vessels operating in the notoriously harsh North Atlantic. Unlike the rigid hulls of Mediterranean ships designed for calmer waters, the longship could ride over waves rather than fighting against them, absorbing the impact through its entire structure. Survivors of modern replica voyages often describe the sensation as being part of the sea rather than fighting it. The iconic dragon or serpent heads adorning the prows weren't merely decorative. These removable carvings served multiple purposes: intimidation of enemies, protection against sea spirits, and practical identification of vessels from a distance. They were typically removed when approaching friendly territory to signal peaceful intentions. Propulsion came from both oars and a single square sail made of woven wool, providing operational flexibility impossible for purely sailing or rowing vessels. When winds were favourable, the sail dramatically extended range and conserved energy. When winds failed or precise manoeuvring was needed, oars provided reliable power. This dual capability allowed Vikings to strike predictably, regardless of wind conditions, a military advantage that their victims, accustomed to the limitations of contemporary shipping, initially failed to appreciate. The archaeological record has preserved several Viking vessels that illuminate their evolution. The Oseberg ship, built around 820 CE and discovered in a burial mound in Norway, represents the aristocratic end of the spectrum, a beautifully decorated vessel, likely used for coastal journeys rather than ocean voyages. The Gokstad ship from around 890 CE shows a more seaworthy design, while the Skuldelev ships, 5 vessels deliberately sunk to block a Danish fjord, around 1070, demonstrate the diversity of specialised craft that had developed by the late Viking Age. How did these mariners navigate the open ocean without compasses, sextants or charts? This question has puzzled historians for centuries, with the Norse sagas offering only tantalisingly vague descriptions. Recent experimental archaeology has suggested a combination of techniques including solar positioning, star observations, awareness of prevailing winds and currents, monitoring of wildlife and cloud formations, and possibly the use of primitive sunstones, crystals that can determine the sun's position even in overcast conditions. The Vikings' practical knowledge of their environment was extensive. They understood that certain birds would fly toward land in the evening, that specific cloud formations gathered over islands, and that ocean swells changed character near coasts. They navigated by sailing along latitude lines, maintaining a consistent solar elevation that would lead them to known land masses. Most importantly, they accepted risk as inevitable, understanding that discovery required venturing into the unknown with imperfect information. Their sailing season typically ran from spring to early autumn, avoiding the worst winter storms. Even within this window, voyages were planned around weather patterns and seasonal winds. The journey from Norway to Iceland, for instance, was best undertaken in spring, when prevailing easterlies could carry ships westward. Return voyages waited for autumn winds from the west. This awareness of seasonal patterns allowed for surprisingly reliable long-distance travel despite technological limitations. The effectiveness of these navigation methods is demonstrated by the Norse discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately North America, achievements that would not be replicated by other Europeans for centuries. Their ability to return repeatedly to distant locations, establishing stable trade routes across open ocean, represents one of history's most impressive feats of pre-instrumental navigation. If ships enabled Viking mobility, their weapons and tactics determined their effectiveness once they arrived. The archetypal Viking warrior carried a combination of weapons suited to different combat situations. The spear served as the primary weapon for most, economical to produce, effective in formation fighting, and versatile for both thrusting and throwing. Swords, more expensive and status-laden, were typically carried only by wealthier warriors. The battle axe, perhaps the weapon most associated with Vikings in popular culture, provided devastating cutting power, capable of defeating shields and armour. Archaeological finds reveal sophisticated weapon-making technology. The best Viking swords featured pattern-welded blades, a technique where iron strips of varying carbon content were twisted and hammered together, creating both strength and flexibility. Some incorporated steel edges around softer iron cores, optimizing both sharpness and resistance to breaking. Certain blades bore maker's marks or inscriptions, suggesting specialized workshops and early brand recognition. Defensive equipment typically included a round wooden shield rimmed with iron, sometimes covered with leather. Helmets, contrary to popular depictions with horns, were simple conical or segmented designs with nose guards. Mail shirts, byrnies, provided excellent protection, but were expensive and relatively rare, with most warriors relying primarily on shields for defence. Viking battle tactics evolved over the period. Early raids relied on surprise and mobility rather than pitched battles. Ships would approach quietly, warriors would land at unexpected locations, strike quickly, and retreat before local forces could organise effective resistance. As their ambitions grew from raiding to conquest, Vikings adapted to more conventional warfare, including siege techniques and formation fighting. The most famous Viking battle formation was the shield wall, Skjaldborg, a tight line of overlapping shields that created a nearly impenetrable barrier when properly maintained. Breaking an enemy's shield wall became the primary objective in pitched battles, often achieved through concentrated pressure at weak points or by creating gaps with missile weapons. Much has been written about berserkers, warriors supposedly fighting in a trance-like fury without armour. While contemporary accounts mention such fighters, the reality was likely less mystical than later depictions suggest. Some warriors may have used mind-altering substances or psychological techniques to overcome fear, but the image of uncontrollable, frenzied fighters contradicts the disciplined tactics evident in Viking military successes. Viking warfare was neither mindlessly brutal nor particularly chivalrous by the standards of the time. It was pragmatic, adaptable, and focused on achieving objectives with minimal losses. When raiding, Vikings preferred to avoid pitched battles entirely. When conquest became the goal, they showed remarkable ability to adapt to local conditions, learning siege warfare, horseback fighting, and other techniques as needed. This pragmatism extended to their treatment of opponents. Contrary to their portrayal in Christian sources as uniquely savage, Vikings operated according to the harsh standards of early medieval warfare. They could be merciful when ransom was profitable, and ruthless when resistance threatened their objectives. Their reputation for extreme brutality stems largely from their targeting of religious sites. Attacks seen as sacrilegious by Christian chroniclers, but viewed by the Vikings themselves as simply striking the wealthiest, least defended targets. The combination of superior naval mobility, effective weapons, and adaptive tactics gave Vikings a military advantage disproportionate to their numbers. A force of a few hundred warriors could threaten regions with much larger populations by striking unpredictably, exploiting political divisions, and withdrawing before effective resistance could be organised. This mobility-based advantage would remain central to Viking operations throughout the age of expansion. Before Christianity gradually transformed Scandinavia, the Norse inhabited a mental landscape populated by gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and other supernatural beings. Their cosmology, preserved primarily through later Icelandic texts, presented a universe both complex and precarious, where even the gods faced ultimate defeat in the prophesied battle of Ragnarok. At the centre of this cosmos stood Yggdrasil, the World Tree, an immense ash connecting 9 realms spread across 3 levels. At the top level sat Asgard, home of the Aesir gods, Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, and Alfheim, realm of the Light Elves. The middle level contained Midgard, the human world, Jotunheim, land of giants, Nidavellir, dwarf realm, and Svartalfheim, dark elf world. The lowest level held Helheim, realm of the dead, and Niflheim, world of ice and mist. This cosmic geography wasn't merely mythological, but shaped how the Norse understood their place in the universe. Humans occupying a middle position between higher and lower powers. The tree itself suffered constant damage. A dragon gnawed at its roots, 4 deer consumed its foliage, and decay threatened its trunk. This imagery of cosmic vulnerability reflected the Norse view of existence as inherently unstable, requiring constant maintenance through proper ritual and action. Unlike the omnipotent deity of Christianity, Norse gods were powerful but limited beings with distinct personalities and flaws. They fell broadly into 2 groups: the Aesir, associated with war and governance, and the Vanir, linked to fertility and prosperity. According to myth, these 2 divine families had once fought before reaching an accommodation, perhaps reflecting historical tensions between different religious practices in early Scandinavia. Odin the Allfather ruled as chief of the Aesir, a complex deity associated with wisdom, poetry, death and magic. He sacrificed an eye for knowledge and hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain understanding of the runes. Depicted as one-eyed, often accompanied by ravens and wolves, Odin represented the pursuit of wisdom through sacrifice. His hall, Valhalla, received half of those slain in battle, collected by his female warrior emissaries, the Valkyries. Thor, son of Odin, embodied physical strength and protection. Armed with his hammer Mjolnir, Thor defended both gods and humans against the chaotic forces of the giants. Archaeological evidence suggests Thor was particularly popular among common people, with hammer amulets being the most frequently found religious symbols from the Viking Age. As a guardian against chaos and a god associated with weather and crops, Thor represented the necessary force that maintained cosmic and social order. Freyr and Freya, twin deities of the Vanir, governed fertility, sexuality, and prosperity. Freya, who received the other half of battle-slain warriors, in her hall Folkvanga, was associated with love, beauty, and Sedr, a form of magic particularly connected with women. Freya governed male fertility, sunshine, and rain. Their father Njörður ruled the sea and maritime prosperity, vital concerns for a seafaring culture. Loki, a figure of ambiguous status, represented both creativity and destructive chaos. Neither fully god nor giant, Loki alternately helped and hindered the gods, eventually bringing about their downfall by orchestrating the death of Baldur, god of light and purity. His complex character embodied the Norse recognition that creation and destruction were inseparable forces. Lesser deities governed specific domains. Tyr oversaw law and justice. Heimdall guarded the rainbow bridge Bifrost connecting the realms. Frigg, Odin's wife, protected marriage and motherhood. Hel ruled the underworld realm named after her. Beyond the gods, supernatural beings included elves, associated with fertility, dwarves, master craftsmen, giants, primordial forces of chaos, and various spirits inhabiting the natural world. What makes Norse religion particularly distinctive is its fatalistic outlook. Unlike many belief systems where good ultimately triumphs, Norse mythology culminates in Ragnarok, the fate of the gods, where cosmic order would collapse, most deities would perish in battle against chaotic forces, and the world would be destroyed before a new cycle began. This acceptance of inevitable doom, coupled with the ideal of facing it with courage, profoundly shaped Norse ethics and worldview. How did these beliefs manifest in actual religious practice? Archaeological evidence, combined with later textual sources, suggests a combination of public ceremonies and private household worship. Large temples existed, though they were likely simpler structures than contemporary Christian churches. The most famous, the temple at Uppsala described by Adam of Bremen around 1075 CE, featured statues of Thor, Odin, and Freyr, with sacrifices performed on a 9-year cycle. More common were smaller shrines and sacred groves where local communities gathered for seasonal celebrations. The archaeological record shows ritual deposits in bogs, lakes and wells, offerings to supernatural powers that included weapons, jewellery, food, and occasionally animals or humans. Excavations at Apokra in Sweden revealed a ceremonial building, repeatedly reconstructed in the same location over centuries, suggesting continuity in sacred space. The religious calendar centred around seasonal transitions. While details varied regionally, common celebrations included midwinter festivities, later incorporated into Christmas, spring equinox rituals for fertility, midsummer celebrations and harvest festivals. These observances combined religious ceremony with community gathering, feast and entertainment, reinforcing social bonds while honouring the gods. Ritual sacrifices, a blot, formed the core of public worship. These ranged from offerings of food and drink to animal sacrifices and, in extreme circumstances, human sacrifice. The latter, while sensationalised in some accounts, appears to have been exceptional rather than routine. Archaeological evidence confirms some instances, such as the bodies found at Trelleborg in Denmark and the description of sacrifices at Uppsala. But these represent extraordinary circumstances rather than regular practice. More typical was the ceremonial slaughter of livestock, particularly in autumn when herds needed thinning before winter. The meat would be consumed in communal feasts after a portion was dedicated to the gods, combining practical necessity with religious observance. Ritual drinking played a central role, with toasts to gods and ancestors forming a structured part of ceremonies. Private worship centred around the household. Each family maintained its own relationship with gods, ancestors, and local spirits. Small figurines of deities found in domestic contexts suggest household shrines. The concept of luck, Hamingja, was particularly important, a kind of inheritable spiritual force that could be strengthened or weakened by proper or improper action. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Norse religious practice was its pragmatism. The relationship between humans and gods resembled a transaction more than unconditional devotion. Worshippers made offerings with the expectation of specific benefits, good harvests, victory in battle, safe voyages, rather than for abstract spiritual salvation. If a deity failed to deliver the expected results, worshippers might redirect their attention to more responsive gods. This transactional approach helps explain the relatively peaceful transition to Christianity in many areas. When Norse rulers converted, often for political advantages, many subjects pragmatically accepted the new god who seemed to be delivering success to their leaders. The old beliefs didn't disappear overnight, but gradually blended with Christian practices in a syncretic process that would continue for centuries. Norse concepts of death and afterlife were more complex than the popular image of Valhalla suggests. While warriors might hope to join Odin's chosen Einherjar to feast and fight until Ragnarok, this was just one possible posthumous destination. Some might join Freyr in Folkvanga, others descend to Hell's realm, not initially a place of punishment, but simply the dwelling of most dead. while still others might remain near their burial mounds as Draugr corporeal undead, or join the ancestors guarding the family. Burial practices reflected these varied beliefs. Archaeological evidence shows considerable diversity. Cremations and inhumations, simple graves and elaborate ship burials, bodies accompanied by rich goods or interred with minimal offerings. Status, cause of death, personal beliefs, and regional traditions all influenced funerary customs. The most spectacular Viking burials involved ships, like those found at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway. These elaborate interments included not just vessels, but extensive grave goods, weapons, tools, food, clothing, furniture, slaughtered animals, and occasionally sacrificed servants or slaves. Such burials represented enormous economic investment, reserved for the highest elites. More common were cremations on pyres, with the ashes placed in urns or pits, sometimes under mounds. Grave goods typically included personal items and tools appropriate to the deceased's gender and status, weapons and tools for men, jewellery, textile implements, and household items for women. These provisions suggest belief in a material afterlife requiring physical objects. The religious world of the Vikings was not static, but evolved throughout the period. Early Viking Age religion appears more focused on Thor and fertility deities, while Odin gained prominence later, particularly among warrior elites. As Scandinavians encountered Christians abroad, religious ideas cross-fertilised, with concepts from both traditions influencing each other during the long conversion process. This spiritual framework, with its emphasis on fate, courage in the face of inevitable defeat, and maintaining cosmic order against chaos, provided psychological underpinning for the Viking phenomenon. It shaped a worldview where daring exploration, raiding, and even death in distant lands could be meaningful within a cosmic narrative of predetermined destiny faced with unflinching courage. After the initial shock of raids on coastal monasteries, Viking activity in the British Isles intensified dramatically in the mid-9th century. What began as seasonal raiding evolved into something far more ambitious, conquest and settlement that would permanently alter the political and cultural landscape of Britain and Ireland. The transformation began in 865 CE with the arrival of what Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army, a force larger and more organised than previous raiding parties. Led by the sons of the semi-legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. This army didn't follow the established pattern of raiding and retreating. Instead, they established winter camps, brought horses for mobility, and systematically targeted Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one by one. Their first major victory came against the Kingdom of Northumbria. Exploiting a civil war between rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne, the Vikings captured York, which they called Jorvik, in 866. This strategically located Roman city became their power base in northern England. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate in York have revealed a thriving Viking Age urban centre with evidence of craft specialisation, international trade and cultural blending. From this secure foothold, the Great Army turned south, defeating the Kingdom of East Anglia in 869. A campaign marked by the execution of King Edmund, later venerated as a saint. Mercia fell next, with its king driven into exile in 873. By 874, only the Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great remained to oppose Viking dominance in England. Alfred's ultimate success in halting the Viking advance, beginning with his victory at the Battle of Edington in 878, prevented complete Scandinavian conquest of England. The resulting treaty established Danelaw, a region of northern and eastern England where Danish law and customs would prevail. This agreement transformed what had been a military occupation into a framework for settlement and governance. The archaeological footprint of this settlement is evident in place names, burial patterns, and material culture. Across the Danelaw, hundreds of place names ending in dash by dash, meaning farm or village, dash, thorpe, dash, secondary settlement, dash and dash, toft, dash, homestead mark areas of Scandinavian influence. Lincoln, Derby, Whitby, and scores of other modern towns bear these linguistic markers of Viking settlement. DNA studies of modern British populations confirm substantial Scandinavian genetic contribution in these regions. Recent research suggests that between 2% and 4% of modern British DNA derives from Norwegian and Danish settlers of this period, a proportion that rises to 10 to 15% in some parts of northern and eastern England. The nature of this settlement remains debated. Was it primarily military colonisation by male warriors, or did it involve significant numbers of women and families? Archaeological evidence increasingly supports substantial female migration, with distinctively Scandinavian female grave goods and jewellery found throughout Danelaw. This suggests family migration, rather than simply male warriors taking local wives. In Danelaw, a distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian culture emerged, blending elements from both traditions. Architectural styles, artistic motifs, legal concepts and vocabulary merged to create something neither purely Norse nor Anglo-Saxon. The English language itself was profoundly influenced, incorporating everyday Norse words like sky, egg, law, husband, window, and hundreds more, evidence of intimate daily interaction rather than mere political overlay. Viking influence extended beyond the Danelaw through continued raiding and political manoeuvring. A second wave of Norse activity began in the early 10th century, with new armies arriving from Denmark. By the early 11th century, England would briefly become part of a North Sea empire under the Danish King Canute, a development we'll explore in a later section. While England experienced a pattern of conquest and settlement, Ireland faced a different Viking impact. Beginning with coastal raids in the 790s, Viking activity in Ireland initially followed familiar patterns of targeting monasteries and their wealth. By the 840s, however, Vikings began establishing permanent coastal bases that would evolve into Ireland's first true urban centres. Dublin, from the Norse Dyflin, derived from the Irish Dublin, was founded as a long fort, a ship base and trading centre, around 841. Archaeological excavations have revealed a bustling settlement with evidence of shipbuilding, metalworking, trade in amber, walrus ivory, and slaves, and connections spanning from the North Atlantic to the Middle East. Similar Norse settlements were established at Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick, names still borne by major Irish cities. Unlike in England, Vikings never controlled large territorial expanses in Ireland. Their power remained concentrated in coastal enclaves, from which they engaged in both trade and raiding. These settlements maintained connections with the Isle of Man, Hebrides and Norway, creating a maritime network across the Irish Sea region. The relationship between Norse settlers and native Irish was complex and fluid. Periods of conflict alternated with alliances, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. By the mid-10th century, many Norse settlers in Ireland had adopted elements of Irish culture and Christianity, while maintaining distinctive identities and overseas connections. The term Hiberno-Norse describes this syncretic culture that was neither purely Scandinavian nor Irish. Ireland's political fragmentation, with numerous small kingdoms rather than larger states, created both opportunities and limitations for Viking ambitions. While preventing unified resistance, it also meant Vikings could never establish dominance comparable to the Danelaw. Instead, Norse leaders became one more factor in the complex power dynamics of Irish politics, sometimes achieving significant influence through alliances with Irish kings. The Scottish Isles experienced perhaps the most thorough Scandinavian colonisation in the British Isles. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, Hebrides, and Isle of Man came under direct Norse control, with substantial settlement evidenced by place names, archaeological remains, and genetic studies. In Orkney and Shetland, Norse language, Norn, continued to be spoken until the 18th century, long after Viking political control had ended. Orkney became a particularly important Norse earldom, controlling sea routes between Scandinavia, Scotland and Ireland. From their base at Kirkwall, the Earls of Orkney maintained significant autonomy. sometimes acknowledging Norwegian overlordship while pursuing independent policies. The Orkney Inga saga records their history, depicting a society that maintained Norse traditions while developing distinctive local characteristics. The Isle of Man developed a unique Hiberno-Norse culture, evidenced by its remarkable stone crosses, combining Celtic artistic traditions with Norse imagery. These monuments, like the Thorwald's Cross, show scenes from both Christian and Norse mythology, visual evidence of cultural and religious blending. This Western expansion represented more than military conquest. It created new hybrid societies and trade networks connecting Scandinavia with the British Isles, continental Europe, and beyond. Dublin became a central hub in a maritime trading system linking Bristol, York, and Norwegian ports. Luxury goods, raw materials, and unfortunately slaves moved through these networks, enriching Norse elites and stimulating urban development. The Vikings' impact on British and Irish societies was transformative but not simply destructive. While their initial raids devastated established centres, particularly monasteries, their subsequent settlement contributed to urbanisation, commercial development, artistic innovation, and political evolution. The threat they posed stimulated state formation, particularly in England, where Alfred and his successors built more centralised governance, partly in response to the Viking challenge. As the 9th century gave way to the 10th, these Western Viking settlements increasingly integrated into local power structures. Many adopted Christianity, formed political alliances with native rulers, and developed distinctive cultural identities that were neither purely Scandinavian nor fully assimilated. Meanwhile, the Scandinavian homelands themselves were undergoing profound transformations, consolidating into kingdoms that would project power in new ways across northern Europe and beyond. As Viking raiders accumulated wealth abroad, profound changes were reshaping their Scandinavian homelands. The 9th and 10th centuries witnessed the emergence of stronger, more centralised kingdoms from what had been a patchwork of chieftaincies and petty realms. This political consolidation would transform not only Scandinavia itself, but also the nature of Viking activity abroad, as ambitious kings sought to harness and direct the energies that had previously fueled independent raiding. In Norway, this process is traditionally associated with Harald Fairhair, Old Norse Harald Hardrada, whose saga depicts him as the first king to unite the country. According to later accounts, particularly Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, Harald's unification campaign began with a dramatic oath, rejected by a princess named Gyda, who declared she would only marry the man who could rule all of Norway. The young Harald vowed neither to cut nor comb his hair until he had conquered the entire country, hence his nickname Fair Hair, or Fine Hair. Whether this romantic motivation is historical or legendary, archaeological and contemporary evidence confirms that a ruler named Harald achieved unprecedented power in western and central Norway during the late 9th century. Through a combination of military victories, strategic marriages, and political alliances, he subdued or expelled rival chieftains and jarls who refused to acknowledge his overlordship. The pivotal moment in Harald's campaign came at the naval battle of Hafrsfjord, fought around 872 CE near modern Stavanger. Here, Harald defeated a coalition of opponents from southwestern Norway, establishing his supremacy over the coastal regions. Stone monuments at Haraldshaugen in Haugesund, traditionally identified as Harald's burial place, commemorate this achievement, though historians debate whether he truly controlled all the territories later attributed to him. Harald's methods of governance set patterns that would influence Scandinavian kingship for generations. Rather than attempting direct rule over his vast territories, he installed loyal jarls, earls, as regional governors, bound to him through oaths of loyalty and family connections. He established a system of royal estates across the country where he could stay while travelling his realm, collected taxes from coastal and agricultural regions, and maintained a formidable military retinue through the wealth these revenues provided. The consequences of Harald's unification extended far beyond Norway's borders. Many chieftains who opposed him chose exile rather than submission, taking their followers to the British Isles, Iceland, and other territories. This political exodus contributed significantly to Norse settlement abroad, particularly in previously uninhabited Iceland, which received many of Norway's displaced aristocratic families. The Icelandic sagas preserve their bitter perspective on Harald, portraying him as a tyrant whose overreach forced freedom-loving Norsemen to seek new homes. Despite Harald's achievements, Norwegian unification remained incomplete and contested. His numerous sons fought among themselves after his death, traditionally dated around 930 CE, fragmenting his realm. It would take generations and the efforts of later rulers, particularly Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, to consolidate what Harald had begun. While Norway's unification process was characterised by conflict and expansion, Denmark's political consolidation followed a somewhat different path. Already more densely populated and geographically compact than Norway, Denmark developed a more stable royal power earlier. By the early 9th century, Danish kings were significant enough to negotiate directly with the Carolingian Empire, as evidenced by diplomatic contacts between Charlemagne and King Godfred of Denmark. The mid-9th century saw Denmark temporarily weakened by internal conflicts and succession disputes, creating opportunities for ambitious chieftains to establish independence. This fragmentation contributed to the formation of the great heathen army that invaded England, as various Danish leaders sought wealth and power abroad that was becoming more difficult to secure at home. The process of reunification began under Gorm the Old, Gorm den Gamle, who established control over Jutland by the early 10th century. Archaeological evidence from the massive ring fortresses at Trelleborg, Fyrkat, Aggersborg and Nonnebakken, perfect circles with precisely arranged internal buildings, suggest increasing royal power and organisational capability during this period. These structures, dated to around 980 CE, demonstrate sophisticated engineering, standardised design, and the ability to mobilise substantial labour forces, all indicators of strong central authority. Gorm's son, Harald Bluetooth, Harald Blåtand, expanded Danish royal power further, extending control over parts of southern Norway and possibly portions of what is now Sweden. Around 965 CE, Harald made a decision that would profoundly alter Scandinavia's future. He officially converted to Christianity. The massive runestone he erected at Jelling commemorates this momentous shift. Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The Jelling monument complex, with its enormous burial mounds, runestones and church, symbolises the transformation of Denmark from a pagan confederation to a Christian kingdom. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Harald constructed a massive ship-shaped stone setting over 350 metres long at the site, demonstrating both his resources and his desire to create an impressive royal centre that merged traditional Norse symbolism with his new Christian faith. Harald's conversion was likely motivated by a combination of political calculation and genuine religious conviction. Christianity offered advantages for a ruler seeking to strengthen central authority. It provided literate administrators, legitimised kingship through divine sanction, and facilitated closer relations with other European powers. Accepting Christianity also neutralised the threat of crusades against pagan Denmark, a growing concern as Christian Europe became more militarily assertive. The process of state formation in Sweden followed yet another pattern, influenced by its geography and position. Divided between the Svea people of Uppland in the north and the Götar of Östergötland and Västergötland in the south, early Sweden, or Svealand, lacked the geographic coherence of Denmark. Its orientation was as much eastward toward the Baltic and Russia as westward toward the North Sea. Archaeological evidence from trading centres like Birka and Helgö shows that by the 8th century, the Svea kings at Uppsala had established significant control over Baltic trade networks. The magnificent ship burials at Vendel and Valsgärde, dating from the 6th to 10th centuries, demonstrate the wealth and power of the elite that would eventually form Sweden's ruling dynasty. The first historically documented king to rule both Svea and Götar was Olaf Skotkonung, who came to power around 995 CE. Like Harald Bluetooth, Olaf converted to Christianity, being baptized around 1008 CE at Huseby in Västergötland. Also like Harald, he began minting coins bearing his name and title, a significant indicator of royal authority and economic control. What drove this process of political consolidation across Scandinavia? Several interconnected factors contributed to the rise of stronger kingship during this period. The wealth flowing into Scandinavia from raiding, trading, and tribute created new resources for ambitious leaders to attract followers and reward loyalty. Kings who could control access to foreign wealth, whether through taxing returning raiders or monopolizing certain trade routes, gained advantages over rivals. Contact with more centralized European kingdoms provided both models and incentives for Scandinavian rulers to strengthen their own authority. The threat posed by the expanding Carolingian Empire and later the Ottonian Empire encouraged political unification as a defensive measure, while diplomatic relations exposed Norse leaders to concepts of Christian kingship that emphasized centralized authority. Technological and administrative innovations, including improved shipbuilding, more effective weapons, and eventually written administration through Christianity, enabled rulers to project power more efficiently across their territories. Religious change, particularly the gradual conversion to Christianity, provided kings with new sources of legitimacy and administrative tools. Christian ideology supported the concept of a single ruler, divinely sanctioned to govern his people, a significant shift from traditional Norse concepts of kingship based primarily on personal prowess and success in war. The process of state formation transformed not just political structures, but the entire society. As kings consolidated power, they established more regular taxation, created administrative districts, minted coins, promulgated laws applicable to their entire realms, and began to define territorial boundaries more precisely. The fluid, kinship-based power networks of the early Viking Age gradually gave way to more territorial conceptions of authority. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it uncontested. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian kings faced resistance from regional elites accustomed to independence, religious conservatives opposed to Christianity, and rival claimants to royal power. The sagas record numerous rebellions, usurpations, and conflicts that complicated the path towards centralized kingdoms. Nevertheless, by the end of the Viking Age, the political landscape of Scandinavia had been fundamentally altered. The fragmented chieftaincies of the 8th century had consolidated into 3 recognizable kingdoms: Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, each with established royal dynasties, administrative structures, and increasingly Christian identities. These emerging states would project power in new ways, sponsoring larger and more organized overseas expeditions, and eventually establishing short-lived empires across the North Sea and Baltic regions. While the western expansion of the Vikings into Britain, Ireland, and the North Atlantic has dominated popular accounts, equally significant was their eastward movement along the rivers of Eastern Europe. This less familiar chapter of Viking history involved different actors, strategies, and outcomes, yet proved just as consequential for European development. The eastern expansion followed a fundamentally different pattern from the western raids. Instead of coastal attacks on wealthy religious centres, the eastern Vikings, primarily Swedes known as Russes or Varangians, established trade routes along the major river systems of Eastern Europe, founded or dominated urban centres, and eventually created political structures that would evolve into the medieval Russian state. This eastern activity began earlier than is often recognised. Archaeological evidence from Staraya Ladoga, near Lake Ladoga in northwestern Russia, confirms a Scandinavian presence by the mid-8th century, predating the Lindisfarne raid. This settlement, called Aldigjuborg by the Norse, served as a gateway between the Baltic and the interior river systems of Russia. excavations have yielded Scandinavian artifacts, including weapons, jewellery, and runestones, alongside Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic materials, evidence of a multicultural trading community. The geography of Eastern Europe, with its interconnected river systems, created natural highways for trade and expansion. From the Baltic, Swedish Vikings could enter the Gulf of Finland, then access the Neva River leading to Lake Ladoga. From there, the Folkov River led south toward Lake Ilmen and Novgorod. Portaging their ships between river systems, they could reach the headwaters of the Dnieper flowing to the Black Sea, or the Volga leading to the Caspian. This riverine network connected the fur-rich forests of the north with the wealthy markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world, a commercial opportunity that Scandinavian traders were uniquely positioned to exploit with their shallow draft vessels and maritime expertise. The paradox that defines the Eastern Viking expansion is that these foreign warriors simultaneously served as both disruptive raiders and state-building founders. How could the same groups that appeared as threatening outsiders in some contexts become the organising elites in others? The answer lies in the political and economic conditions they encountered in Eastern Europe. Unlike Western Europe, with its legacy of Roman administration and Christian ecclesiastical structures, the territories of what would become Russia were politically fragmented among various Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic peoples. The primary chronicle, a medieval Kievan text, describes a situation of tribal conflict that created an opening for external leadership. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." They accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Rus. They said to the Rus, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." While this account written centuries later certainly simplifies and mythologizes the process, archaeological and linguistic evidence confirms that Scandinavian elites did establish themselves as rulers over predominantly Slavic populations in key centres along the trade routes. The most significant of these Scandinavian leaders was Rurik, who according to tradition established himself at Novgorod around 862 CE. Whether invited or imposing himself through force, Rurik became the founder of the dynasty that would rule the emerging Russia's state for centuries. His successors, particularly Oleg, Old Norse Helgi, expanded their control southward, capturing Kiev around 882 CE and establishing it as the new centre of what would become Kievan Russes. Archaeological evidence from urban centres along these river routes reveals the multicultural nature of early Russes society. At Gnezdovo near Smolensk, excavations have uncovered one of Eastern Europe's largest complexes of burial mounds, containing both Scandinavian and Slavic graves. The artefacts found there, including Thor's hammer amulets, Arabic coins, Byzantine jewellery, and weapons of Scandinavian design, demonstrate the international connections maintained by these communities. The material culture shows a gradual blending of Norse and Slavic elements over time. Early settlements and burials display distinctively Scandinavian characteristics, but by the late 10th century, these markers become less pronounced as the Varangian elites progressively adopted local languages and customs while maintaining their trade connections and some cultural distinctions. The interactions between Scandinavian newcomers and the indigenous peoples of the region, primarily Slavic tribes but also Baltic and Finnic groups, varied by location and time period. In some areas, particularly major trading centres, evidence suggests relatively peaceful coexistence and gradual integration. In others, fortifications and weapons finds indicate more conflictual relationships. What made the Rus Vikings particularly effective in this environment was their ability to operate as both merchants and warriors as circumstances required. The same skills that made them formidable raiders in the West, naval mobility, effective weaponry, and organisational capability, allowed them to control key points along the eastern trade routes and extract tribute from surrounding populations. The primary chronicle describes how the early Rus's rulers collected tribute in furs, honey and slaves from Slavic and Finnic tribes, using these resources to finance their commercial and military operations. Archaeological evidence confirms this economic pattern, with concentrations of foreign coins and luxury goods at centres of Russ's power. The material evidence of this eastern trade is impressive. Excavations across Scandinavia, particularly on Gotland, have yielded over 200,000 Arabic silver coins, dirhams, dating from the 8th to 11th centuries. These finds, along with Byzantine silks, Caucasian glassware, and other Eastern luxury goods, demonstrate the scale and significance of this commerce. The most vivid written account of the Eastern Vikings comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Russ's traders along the Volga River in 922 CE. His detailed description provides a rare outsider's perspective on these Scandinavian merchants operating deep in Eastern territory. "I've seen the Russ as they came on their merchant journeys, and were encamped by the Volga. I've never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Each man has an axe, a sword, and a knife, and keeps each by him at all times. Each woman wears on either breast a box of iron, silver, copper, or gold. Around their necks they wear bands of gold and silver." Ibn Fadlan's account, while containing elements of cultural misunderstanding and exaggeration, offers valuable insights into Russ's appearance, customs, religious practices, and commercial activities. He describes their ritual washing, their elaborate funerary practices, including a ship cremation of a chieftain, and their trading methods, all details that complement the archaeological record. The Eastern Vikings established or developed a string of urban centres along their trade routes. Beyond Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod in the north, important settlements included Polotsk, Smolensk, Chernigov, and ultimately Kiev, which became the centre of the Russ's state by the early 10th century. These towns functioned as collection points for tribute, manufacturing centres for processed goods, and transfer points for long-distance trade. What began as trading posts gradually evolved into more complex urban centres with diverse populations. Archaeological evidence shows craft specialisation, with workshops producing jewellery, weapons, glassware and textiles. The layout of these early towns typically featured a fortified centre, Detonets, later called Kremlin, housing the prince and elite, surrounded by a commercial district where craftspeople and merchants lived and worked. By the mid-10th century, the Rus had established regular trading connections with the Byzantine Empire, conducting annual trading expeditions down the Dnieper to Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, describes these journeys in detail in his De Administrando Imperio, explaining how the Russes assembled fleets of monoxyla, dugout boats, each spring, navigated the dangerous Dnieper rapids, and conducted trade under carefully regulated conditions in Constantinople. These commercial expeditions occasionally turned to military adventures. In 860, 907, and 941 CE, Russ's fleets attacked Constantinople itself, though with limited success against the city's formidable defences. More effective was their raiding along the Black Sea coasts, where Byzantine provincial towns proved more vulnerable. The Caspian Sea region also suffered Rus raids, with major expeditions recorded in 913 and 943 targeting wealthy Islamic cities along its shores. The relationship between the Rus and their eastern trading partners was complex and evolving, initially appearing as dangerous raiders and hard-bargaining merchants. By the late 10th century, the Rus had become integrated into regional diplomatic networks. The marriage of Vladimir the Great of Kiev to the Byzantine princess Anna in 989 symbolised this transformation from outsiders to recognised players in the medieval Eastern world. As the 10th century progressed, the Scandinavian character of the Rus elite gradually diminished through intermarriage with Slavic families and cultural assimilation. Vladimir's conversion to Orthodox Christianity in 988 CE accelerated this process, aligning the Rus' state more firmly with Byzantine cultural influence rather than its Norse roots. Nevertheless, connections with Scandinavia persisted. archaeological evidence shows continued trade between Russ's territories and Sweden into the 11th century. Scandinavian mercenaries remained important in Russ's military forces, and dynastic marriages occasionally renewed the northern connection. As late as 1019, Yaroslav the Wise secured his position as Grand Prince of Kiev, with the help of Swedish warriors provided by his father-in-law, King Olof Skutkonung. The legacy of this Viking Age interaction would be profound and enduring. The very name Russia derives from Rus, originally referring to the Scandinavian traders and warriors. The first East Slavic state emerged under Varangian leadership, establishing political structures that would influence Russian development for centuries. Trade routes pioneered during this period connected northern Europe with Central Asia and the Middle East, facilitating cultural and economic exchange across vast distances. Yet unlike in parts of the British Isles, where Norse language and customs left a heavy imprint, the Scandinavian contribution to Russian culture was primarily organisational and political, rather than linguistic or religious. The relatively small numbers of Varangians were gradually absorbed into the much larger Slavic population, leaving subtle traces in vocabulary, legal concepts and elite military traditions, rather than transforming the fundamental character of East Slavic society. The most ambitious Viking expeditions reached far beyond the Baltic into the glittering civilizations of Byzantium and the Islamic world. These journeys, covering thousands of miles through hostile territory, represent some of history's most remarkable commercial ventures, connecting the remote forests of the north with the sophisticated urban centres of the Mediterranean and Middle East. No destination held more fascination for the Norsemen than Constantinople, Miklagard, Great City, in their sagas. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was the largest and wealthiest city in Christian Europe, with a population exceeding 300,000 when most Western European towns counted their inhabitants in mere thousands. Its massive walls, monumental architecture, mechanical wonders, and accumulated treasures made it the marvel of the medieval world. The first recorded Russ's attack on Constantinople came in 860 CE, when a fleet appeared suddenly before the city, taking advantage of the absence of the Byzantine fleet on campaign elsewhere. Though this raid failed to breach the city's formidable defences, it announced the arrival of a new power in the Black Sea region, and began a complex relationship that would evolve from hostility to alliance. Subsequent expeditions in 907 and 941 similarly failed to capture the city, but demonstrated the Rus' capacity to project power over enormous distances. The 907th expedition, led by Prince Oleg according to the primary chronicle, allegedly involved 2,000 ships, certainly an exaggeration but indicating a substantial force. The chronicle claims Oleg mounted his shield on Constantinople's gate as a symbol of victory, though Byzantine sources don't confirm this dramatic gesture. What these military expeditions did achieve was forcing the Byzantines to negotiate commercial treaties. Agreements concluded in 907, 911, and 945 established the terms under which Russ's merchants could trade in Constantinople. These remarkably detailed documents, preserved in the primary chronicle, regulated everything from the number of merchants allowed to enter the city, limited to 50 at a time, to their accommodations in the St. Mama's Quarter, outside the walls, to the diplomatic immunities they enjoyed. The most dramatic development in Byzantine-Russ's relations came when some Vikings transitioned from occasional raiders to trusted imperial guardsmen. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army, composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, became the emperor's personal bodyguard and one of the most prestigious military forces in the medieval world. The Guards formation is traditionally attributed to an agreement between Emperor Basil II and Vladimir I of Kiev in 988, when Vladimir provided 6,000 warriors to help Basil defeat a rebellion. Impressed by their loyalty and fighting prowess, the emperor retained these Northmen as his personal guard, beginning an institution that would last for centuries. service in the Varangian Guard offered unprecedented opportunities for Scandinavian warriors. The pay was exceptional. Byzantine military salaries far exceeded anything available in the north. The prestige was immense, guarding the most powerful Christian ruler in the world. Perhaps most attractive was the possibility of participating in the emperor's spoils system. When a new emperor took power or achieved major victories, the Guard received ceremonial distributions of gold, while successful campaigns offered opportunities for plunder and ransoms. Archaeological evidence of this service appears across Scandinavia in the form of Byzantine coins, jewellery, silks and religious objects brought home by returning guardsmen. Runestones in Sweden commemorate men who served in the south. One from Pilgårds on Gotland states simply, "They fared like men far after gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle." They died in the south in Sörkland, the Islamic territories. The most famous Varangian was Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler, King of Norway. After fleeing Norway as a teenager following his half-brother's defeat, Harald spent years in Russi's and then Byzantine service, participating in campaigns from Sicily to the Holy Land. Byzantine sources describe his exploits, including his clever capture of a Sicilian city by having his men request permission to bury a dead commander inside the walls. The corpse then springing to life to open the gates. Harald eventually returned to Norway with enormous wealth, acquired during his Byzantine service. According to the sagas, he had to use multiple ships to transport his treasure, which included not just gold and silver but silks, jewellery, and exotic weapons. This wealth funded his successful bid for the Norwegian throne and his subsequent campaigns, including his final fatal invasion of England in 1066. While Constantinople attracted Norse warriors seeking service in the prestigious Varangian Guard, the Islamic world drew Viking merchants pursuing commercial opportunities. The Abbasid Caliphate centred in Baghdad and the competing Umayyad Caliphate in Spain represented the height of early medieval civilization, with sophisticated economies, advanced scholarship, and demand for northern products like furs, amber, honey, and slaves. The primary route to the Islamic lands followed the Volga River to the Caspian Sea, from which merchants could reach the wealthy cities of Persia and Central Asia. Archaeological evidence of this trade appears in the form of hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, found across Scandinavia and the Baltic region, particularly concentrated on the Swedish island of Gotland. The scale of this commerce was enormous. A single hoard discovered at Spillings on Gotland contained over 14,000 silver coins, primarily from Islamic mints, along with silver ingots and jewellery, the largest Viking Age silver treasure ever found. Analysis of these coin finds shows they originated from mints throughout the Islamic world, from Spain and North Africa to Afghanistan and Central Asia, demonstrating the extent of these trading networks. Ibn Fadlan's famous account provides our most detailed view of Rus's traders operating in Islamic territory. Sent as an emissary from the Abbasid Caliph to the Volga Bulgars in 922 CEE, he encountered Rus's merchants along the Volga and recorded his observations with ethnographic precision. His description of a chieftain's funeral is particularly valuable, detailing an elaborate ship cremation that included animal sacrifices and the voluntary death of a slave girl. Practices known from archaeological evidence, but rarely described in such detail. While Ibn Fadlan's account is generally credible, his perspective as an urbane Muslim diplomat, observing what he considered primitive foreigners, colours his descriptions. He expresses particular disgust at what he perceived as Viking lack of hygiene. Though ironically, his description of their daily washing routine suggests they were actually more concerned with cleanliness than many of their European contemporaries. Other Arabic sources provide additional perspectives on these Norse visitors. The geographer Ibn Khurradadbi, writing around 870 CE, describes Rus merchants bringing beaver and fox furs and swords to Baghdad, noting that they claimed to be Christians to pay lower taxes, though most were still pagans at this time. The diplomat who Ibn Rusta comments on their physical appearance, their island dwelling, likely referring to settlements in Lake Ladoga, and their raids on Slavic peoples. The goods flowing southward through these trade routes included furs, honey, wax, amber, and slaves, the latter being particularly valuable in Islamic markets where demand for labour and military recruits was high. In return, the Rus received silver coins, spices, silks, glassware, and other luxury items unavailable in Northern Europe. This commerce profoundly impacted Scandinavian economies and societies. The influx of silver provided a medium of exchange more portable and divisible than traditional forms of wealth like land or livestock. Islamic weights and measures influenced Scandinavian economic practices, with some Viking Age weights clearly based on Islamic standards. Luxury goods from the south enhanced the prestige of chieftains and kings who could acquire and distribute them, reinforcing social hierarchies. The cultural exchange worked in both directions. Islamic silver was often converted into jewellery, incorporating Norse designs. Arabic coins were sometimes adapted as pendants or decorative elements. Occasionally, Islamic motifs appear in Scandinavian art, showing aesthetic appreciation transcending religious differences. The flow of Eastern silver into Scandinavia declined sharply after about 970 CE, when political instability in the Islamic world disrupted the trade routes and silver mining. This silver crisis coincided with other changes in the Viking world, including increasing Christianization and political centralization, contributing to the transformation of Scandinavian societies in the late Viking Age. Both Byzantine and Islamic sources express ambivalence about their Norse visitors, admiring their physical prowess and commercial acumen, while viewing them as culturally inferior barbarians. This perspective contrasts with Western European accounts that emphasize Viking violence and paganism. In the cosmopolitan East, religious difference was less shocking, and commercial pragmatism often trumped cultural prejudice. For the Vikings themselves, these eastern journeys offered not just material wealth, but exposure to advanced civilizations that would influence their own cultural development. Returning travellers brought back not only silver and silks, but new ideas, technologies, and artistic motifs. The Byzantine influence would be particularly significant following the Christianization of Russian Scandinavia, with Orthodox models shaping early Russian church architecture and religious practices. The legacy of these Eastern connections would be lasting. Trade routes established during the Viking Age created enduring economic networks linking Northern Europe with the Mediterranean and Central Asia. The political structures developed by the Rus laid foundations for the medieval Russian state. Cultural and artistic influences flowed along these routes, contributing to the distinctive synthesis of Norse, Slavic, Byzantine, and Islamic elements that characterized medieval Eastern European civilization. While some Vikings ventured east along the Russian rivers, others sailed west into the vast, uncharted waters of the North Atlantic. This westward expansion, perhaps the most astonishing feat of Viking Age exploration, led to the discovery and settlement of previously uninhabited lands and ultimately to the shores of North America itself. The North Atlantic expansion followed a stepping stone pattern, with each new discovery building on previous knowledge. From their Norwegian homeland, Norse sailors first reached the Shetland and Orkney Islands, already inhabited but transformed by Scandinavian settlement. From there they pushed westward to the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, Greenland, and finally, briefly, to North America, each step requiring longer open ocean voyages into increasingly challenging environments. The Faroe Islands, located roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland, represent the first truly significant Norse expansion into previously uninhabited territory. These windswept islands, rising dramatically from the North Atlantic, were discovered by Irish monks seeking isolation for their ascetic practices. But Norse settlement from the early 9th century quickly displaced or absorbed this small monastic presence. The timing of this settlement is confirmed by both written sources and environmental evidence. The Feringa saga, though compiled centuries later, describes the initial settlement under the leadership of Grimur Kamban. More compelling scientific evidence comes from lake sediment cores, showing a sudden increase in erosion and the appearance of non-native plant species precisely during this period. The arrival of sheep and cattle, accompanied by land clearance, left a clear environmental signature, marking the beginning of human impact on the landscape. Archaeological excavations at sites like Toftanes reveal the typical pattern of Norse settlement. Longhouses built of stone and turf due to the scarcity of timber, with interior arrangements similar to those in Norway. The economy focused on sheep raising, supplemented by fishing, seabird harvesting, and limited barley cultivation in the more sheltered valleys. The difficult environment required adaptation of Norwegian farming practices, foreshadowing the challenges settlers would face in more extreme locations. The Faroes settlement succeeded because it matched the carrying capacity of the environment. With a relatively small population practicing mixed subsistence strategies well suited to the island's resources, the Faroes established a sustainable society that has maintained continuous habitation to the present day. This success stands in marked contrast to later settlements in more challenging environments, where environmental miscalculations would prove fatal. Iceland represented the next and much larger step in Norse Atlantic expansion. Located at the edge of the habitable world, with its interior dominated by glaciers, active volcanoes and barren highlands, Iceland nonetheless offered coastal lowlands suitable for the Norse pastoral economy. Its discovery and settlement constitute one of the best documented colonisation events of the pre-modern era, thanks to remarkably detailed medieval Icelandic sources. According to Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, Iceland was discovered accidentally by a Norwegian named Naddod, who was blown off course while sailing to the Faroes. Other early explorers followed, including Garda Svavarsson, who circumnavigated the island, and Flokki Vilgerdarsson, who gave Iceland its name after seeing drift ice in a fjord. The systematic settlement Landnam began around 874 CE, with the arrival of Ingolfur Arnarsson, traditionally considered Iceland's first permanent settler. What followed was one of history's most rapid colonisation events. Within 60 years, most of Iceland's habitable land had been claimed by settlers arriving primarily from Norway, but also from Norse colonies in the British Isles. The latter brought with them Celtic wives, slaves, and cultural influences, creating a more diverse society than is sometimes recognised. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders confirm this mixed heritage, showing significant Celtic maternal ancestry alongside predominantly Norse paternal lineage. Why did thousands of people abandon their homelands for this remote island? Political developments in Scandinavia, particularly Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway, certainly played a role. Many early settlers were chieftains, and their followers fleeing Harald's increasing authority. Economic factors also contributed. Iceland offered land ownership opportunities for those facing limited prospects at home. The sagas emphasise individual motivations, ranging from blood feuds to simple wanderlust, painting a complex picture of push and pull factors driving migration. Iceland's settlement occurred during an unusually favourable climatic period, with temperatures warmer than today. This medieval warm period made agriculture more viable than it would later become, encouraging optimistic assessments of the island's carrying capacity. Nevertheless, settlers quickly discovered the environment's limitations. The thin soils and short growing season restricted grain cultivation, while the absence of native forests led to rapid deforestation as trees were cut for construction, fuel, and charcoal production. The archaeological record reveals how settlers adapted to these constraints. At sites like Hofstadir and Stung, excavations show farmsteads built primarily of turf and stone, with internal layouts modified from Norwegian models to conserve heat. Faunal remains demonstrate a shift in livestock ratios, with sheep becoming increasingly dominant over the more environmentally demanding cattle. Fishing, initially supplementary, grew more important as the limitations of pastoralism became apparent. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Icelandic settlement was its political organisation. Finding themselves beyond the reach of any established kingdom, the settlers created what some historians have described as the world's first parliamentary democracy, though aristocratic republic might be more accurate. The Althing, established around 930 CE, brought representatives from across Iceland together annually at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates visibly separate. This assembly combined legislative, judicial, and social functions. Laws were recited from memory by the law speaker, disputes were adjudicated, marriages arranged, and alliances formed. The island was divided into quarters, each with regional assemblies, Varthing, handling local matters. While political power remained concentrated among wealthy landowners, Godar, the system provided mechanisms for dispute resolution that prevented the constant warfare that might have made survival impossible in such a marginal environment. Iceland's isolation fostered a unique cultural flowering. The oral traditions brought by settlers, poems, histories and sagas, were eventually preserved in writing following Christianization around 1000 CE. This literature, composed in Old Norse rather than Latin, represents one of the most important vernacular literary traditions of medieval Europe. Works like Njal's Saga, Egil's Saga, and the Poetic Edda provide unparalleled insights into Norse culture while demonstrating sophisticated narrative techniques and psychological depth that continue to influence literature today. As remarkable as Iceland's settlement was, the colonisation of Greenland pushed the limits of Norse adaptation even further. Around 985 CE, Eric the Red led a fleet of settlers from Iceland to the southwestern coast of Greenland, establishing two main settlements: the eastern settlement in modern Qaqortoq district and the smaller western settlement near present-day Nuuk. A third, smaller middle settlement developed between them. Eric's expedition followed his exploration of Greenland during a 3-year exile from Iceland, imposed as punishment for killings. According to Eric's saga, he deliberately named the ice-covered land Greenland to attract settlers, an early example of misleading real estate marketing. While the name was certainly optimistic, the southwestern coastal areas were indeed greener than much of Iceland, with fjords offering sheltered locations for farms. Archaeological excavations at sites like Brattahlid, Eric's own farm, and Gardar, the episcopal seat after Christianization, reveal substantial settlements with stone and turf buildings, including churches, barns and longhouses similar to those in Iceland. At its peak in the 13th century, the Greenland colony numbered perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people, living on several hundred farms, maintaining a Norse-European identity at the very edge of the habitable world. The Greenland economy relied on a combination of livestock raising, hunting and trading. Cattle, sheep and goats provided the foundation of subsistence, supplemented by hunting seals, caribou and polar bears. Trade with Europe focused on luxury goods like walrus ivory, polar bear pelts and live falcons, exchanged for essential imports including iron, timber and grain. Recent archaeological research has significantly revised our understanding of the Greenlanders' adaptation strategies. Earlier views portrayed them as stubbornly clinging to inappropriate European farming methods. New evidence shows they actually made substantial adaptations, shifting their diet to include more marine mammals, particularly seals, as climate conditions worsened. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains indicates that marine foods eventually constituted up to 80% of their diet, a significant departure from traditional Norse patterns. The Greenland settlements maintained contact with Iceland and Europe through occasional trading voyages, though these became increasingly irregular as the Middle Ages progressed. The colony received a bishop residing at Garda and built impressive stone churches, including a cathedral whose ruins still stand. They paid tithes to the Norwegian crown and the church in the form of walrus ivory and other Arctic products, maintaining their identity as an outpost of European Christendom. Despite these adaptations and connections, the Greenland colony ultimately failed. The western settlement was abandoned around 1350, while the eastern settlement persisted until approximately 1450, before disappearing from European records. The colony's demise has generated extensive scholarly debate, with multiple factors likely contributing to this complex historical event. Climate change played a significant role. The medieval warm period that facilitated initial settlement gave way to the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300. Cooling temperatures shortened growing seasons, increased sea ice that blocked harbours, and made livestock raising increasingly difficult. Paleoclimatic evidence from ice cores confirms this deterioration in conditions precisely when the settlements were struggling. Economic factors also contributed. The European market for walrus ivory collapsed as elephant ivory from Africa became more available. Without these valuable trade goods, Greenland lost its ability to import essential supplies. Declining trade meant fewer ships making the dangerous voyage, increasing the colony's isolation. Social and cultural factors may have limited adaptation. Despite adopting some hunting practices, the Norse apparently never fully embraced Inuit technologies like the kayak and toggle harpoon that might have improved their chances of survival. Evidence of contact between Norse and Inuit exists, but relations appear to have been primarily hostile rather than cooperative, preventing beneficial cultural exchange. Finally, demographic challenges including outmigration, declining birth rates, and possibly disease contributed to the settlement's vulnerability. With a small population already living at the margins of survival, any additional stresses could prove catastrophic. The abandonment of the Greenland settlements marked the first major reversal in Norse Atlantic expansion, a sobering demonstration that there were indeed limits to their remarkable adaptability. Yet even as Greenland's colonies struggled, Norse explorers had already pushed even further west, reaching the shores of North America itself. The Norse discovery of North America represents one of history's most remarkable exploration achievements, reaching a new continent without charts, compasses, or any prior knowledge of its existence. Yet this momentous discovery, occurring around the year 1000 CE, would ultimately prove transient, with attempted settlements failing within a few years, and the knowledge of these western lands fading into legend until archaeological confirmation in the 20th century. According to the Vinland sagas, primarily Erik's saga and the saga of the Greenlanders, the first European to sight North American shores was Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland around 985 to 986 CE. Bjarni reportedly saw forested coastlines to the west, but did not land, continuing instead to Greenland, where he described his discovery. The first deliberate exploration followed some 15 years later, led by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Purchasing Bjarni's ship and assembling a crew of 35 men, Leif retraced the accidental discovery, this time making landfalls. The sagas describe 3 distinct regions encountered during this voyage: Helluland, Flatstone Land, likely Baffin Island; Markland, Forest Land, probably Labrador; and finally Vinland, Wineland or perhaps Meadowland, the most hospitable region where they established a temporary camp. Leif's expedition discovered wild grapes, or perhaps berries, salmon-filled rivers, and meadows with grass sufficient for livestock, resources that appeared abundant compared to Greenland's marginal environment. The mild winter allowed them to survive comfortably before returning to Greenland, with their ship loaded with timber and vine-related products. News of these discoveries prompted further expeditions. Leif's brother Thorvald led the next voyage, but was killed in a skirmish with indigenous people the Norse called Skrælings, likely either Beothuk or Innu people. A more ambitious colonisation attempt followed under the wealthy Icelandic merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni, who led a group of about 60 men and 5 women with livestock and supplies intended for permanent settlement. Karlsefni's expedition established a settlement and initially traded with indigenous people, exchanging red cloth for furs. However, relations deteriorated after a bull belonging to the Norse frightened the natives, leading to armed conflict. Despite the Norse technological advantages in weapons, the numerical superiority of the indigenous population made the settlement's position untenable. After 3 years of intermittent conflict and the birth of the first European child in the Americas, Snorri Thorfinnsson, the colonists abandoned their settlement and returned to Greenland. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed by historians as mere legends or literary inventions. The breakthrough came in 1960 when Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anstein Ingstad discovered undeniably Norse ruins at Lonso Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Excavations revealed 8 buildings constructed in the typical Norse style, with turf walls and wooden frames, including a large hall, smaller residential structures, workshops, and a smithy. Artifacts recovered from the site confirmed its Norse origin beyond any doubt. A bronze pin of Scandinavian design, a soapstone spindle whirl, and iron boat rivets identical to those used in Viking ships. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement precisely in the period described by the sagas, around 1000 CE. Later excavations identified evidence of metalworking, carpentry, and boat repair activities. The Lance aux Meadows site represents the first confirmed European presence in the Americas, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. However, its scale and duration were limited. Archaeological evidence suggests occupation lasting perhaps 10 to 25 years at most, with a population of 70 to 90 people. During peak activity, the settlement appears to have functioned primarily as a winter-based camp and repair station, supporting further exploration rather than as a self-sustaining colony. The exact relationship between Lonso Meadows and the Finland described in the sagas remains debated. The site itself doesn't match all the saga descriptions. It lacks the wild grapes or self-sown wheat mentioned in the texts. Most scholars now believe Lance aux Meadows served as a gateway settlement, with the more hospitable Vinland, proper located further south, perhaps in the Gulf of St. Lawrence region, or even as far as New England, where wild grapes do grow naturally. Recent archaeological investigations have searched for evidence of additional Norse sites further south, but despite occasional intriguing findings, no other location has been confirmed with the same certainty as Lance aux Meadows. Possible Norse artefacts have been reported from Maine to Rhode Island, but none in context that definitively establish a Norse presence. What if the Norse settlements had succeeded? This tantalising counterfactual has fascinated historians and fiction writers alike. A permanent Norse presence in North America might have dramatically altered the continent's history, potentially creating a Norse indigenous hybrid culture, or establishing European outposts centuries before Columbus. Technology, livestock, and possibly disease might have spread earlier, with unpredictable consequences for indigenous societies. Yet the failure of these settlements reveals the practical limits of Norse expansion. Several factors contributed to their inability to establish permanent footholds in North America. Demographics played a crucial role. The Norse simply lacked the population base to sustain distant colonies, especially when facing numerous indigenous peoples. With the total population of Greenland numbering only a few thousand at its peak, sparing dozens of settlers for a risky venture across the Davis Strait stretched their resources to the breaking point. Distance and logistics created nearly insurmountable challenges. The voyage from Greenland to Vinland was long and dangerous, making regular supply or reinforcement difficult. Unlike their eastern expansion, where river systems provided natural highways into continental interiors, the North American coast offered no such easy access to resources beyond the immediate shoreline. Indigenous resistance proved decisive. Unlike Iceland and Greenland, which were either uninhabited or very sparsely populated, North America contained established societies capable of mounting effective opposition to newcomers. The sagas described the Norse technological advantages in weapons and armour, but these were offset by the natives' superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain. Economic incentives were insufficient to justify the risks. While timber was valuable to the wood-starved Greenlanders, the difficulty of transporting it back to Greenland limited its utility. Other resources discovered in Vinland, while promising, didn't offer the immediate wealth that might have motivated larger colonisation efforts. the Greenland colony itself was struggling for survival by the time written records of Vinland faded. With their own position becoming precarious due to climate change and economic isolation, Greenlanders couldn't spare the resources for speculative ventures further west. Knowledge of these western lands didn't entirely disappear from European awareness. Icelandic annals record a ship arriving from Markland in 1347, suggesting occasional voyages continued long after the settlement attempts had failed. Hints of this knowledge may have influenced later explorers, with some scholars suggesting Columbus might have heard rumours of western lands during a visit to Iceland in 1477, though direct evidence for this is lacking. The Norse discovery of America represents both the high watermark of Viking exploration and the point where their expansion reached its natural limits. It demonstrated their extraordinary maritime capabilities while simultaneously revealing the constraints that would ultimately confine their permanent influence to the North Atlantic and Baltic regions. The roles and status of women in Viking society present one of the most intriguing paradoxes of the period. Within a culture celebrated for masculine warrior values, women enjoyed legal rights, economic opportunities, and social positions that were remarkably progressive compared to much of contemporary Europe. Yet these freedoms existed within a framework that still defined women primarily through their family relationships and household responsibilities. To understand Viking women's lives, we must first examine their legal standing. Scandinavian law codes, while primarily recorded after the Viking Age, preserve older traditions that granted women significant rights. Unlike women in much of medieval Europe, Norse women could own property independently, inherit from parents and deceased husbands, and manage their own finances. A woman's dowry remained her property throughout marriage, and in case of divorce, which women could initiate under certain conditions, she was entitled to reclaim these assets along with a share of common property. These property rights gave women economic leverage and a degree of independence rare for the era. Archaeological evidence from female graves confirms this economic agency, with women often buried with keys symbolising their control over household goods and storerooms, scales for weighing silver, and occasionally merchant tools suggesting direct involvement in trade. Marriage in Viking society functioned as both a personal relationship and a political economic alliance between families. While parents negotiated most marriages, women weren't entirely without voice in the matter. The sagas depict women refusing unsuitable matches or setting conditions for acceptance. Once married, women typically moved to their husband's household, but maintained connections with their birth families who could intervene if they were mistreated. Divorce procedures were remarkably straightforward by medieval standards. A woman could declare herself divorced simply by calling witnesses and stating her reasons, which could include physical abuse, failure to provide support, or even the husband wearing women's clothes. After divorce, children typically remained with the father's family, though arrangements varied based on circumstances and local customs. The most dramatic evidence of women's legal standing comes from the Icelandic law code Gragas, which imposed severe penalties for violating a woman's honour or autonomy. A man could be outlawed, effectively sentenced to death, for forcing a kiss on an unwilling woman. Such protections, while not always enforced in practice, indicate a society that recognised women's right to control their own bodies to a degree unusual for the period. The daily responsibilities of Viking women centred on the household, but this domestic sphere encompassed far more than modern connotations might suggest. Women managed complex economic operations that included food production, textile manufacturing, dairy processing, brewing, and food preservation, all critical to survival in the challenging northern environment. Textile production in particular represented a major economic activity and source of female prestige. Archaeological sites invariably yield evidence of spinning and weaving, spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, and fabric fragments. Creating wool cloth was a time-intensive process, from shearing sheep through spinning, dyeing, and weaving. A single sail for a Viking ship required the wool from more than 200 sheep and thousands of hours of women's labour, making textile production as strategically important as shipbuilding itself. Women's domestic authority was particularly crucial given men's frequent absences. With husbands away on trading expeditions, Viking raids or fishing trips that could last months or even years, women ran farms and businesses, made economic decisions, and represented family interests in local matters. This practical necessity of independence shaped both social expectations and legal frameworks. Beyond these universal female roles, the archaeological record reveals women who stepped outside traditional gender boundaries. The controversial Birka warrior grave in Sweden, burial BJ581, contained a body biologically female, but buried with a full set of weapons, 2 sacrificed horses, and tactical board game pieces suggesting military command. This discovery, confirmed by DNA analysis in 2017, has forced reconsideration of women's potential roles in Viking society. While female warriors were likely exceptional rather than commonplace, literary sources provide additional context for such possibilities. The semi-mythological shield maidens appear in sagas and poems, while historical sources mention women like Lagertha, celebrated in Saxo Grammaticus's history, who reportedly fought alongside men. Whether these represent historical reality, literary invention, or something in between remains debated, but they suggest a cultural framework where female martial activity, while unusual, wasn't unthinkable. More common than female warriors were women who exercised power through religious roles. Before Christianization, women served as völur, singular völva, seers and practitioners of cedar, a form of magic particularly associated with females. Archaeological evidence for such practitioners comes from distinctive graves containing staffs, amulets, and unusual herbs or potions. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest Viking Age graves ever discovered, may have contained such a religious specialist, along with her elaborate ritual equipment. The sagas describe these seers travelling between settlements, conducting ceremonies, entering trance states to communicate with spirits, and making prophecies that influenced major decisions. Their abilities to foretell the future, influence fertility, and potentially harm enemies through magic gave them significant social power, transcending normal gender limitations. The introduction of Christianity gradually restricted these religious leadership opportunities, as the new faith reserved priestly functions for men. However, women played crucial roles in the conversion process itself, often adopting Christianity before their husbands and influencing family religious practices. Once established, the church offered new roles for elite women as patrons of religious institutions, and in some cases as abbesses of wealthy convents. Social status affected women's opportunities and constraints more than gender alone. Elite women commanded servants and slaves, influenced political decisions through their male relatives, and sometimes ruled estates or even territories when male kin were absent. The sagas depict powerful women like Aud the Deep-Minded, who led a migration to Iceland and established a dynasty, or Freydis Eiriksdottir, who travelled to Vinland and allegedly took command during a conflict with indigenous people. At the opposite social extreme, female slaves, thralls, faced harsh conditions with few legal protections. Captured in raids or born into servitude, these women performed the most demanding physical labour and were vulnerable to sexual exploitation. The Ibn Fadlan account graphically describes a slave girl ritually sacrificed during a chieftain's funeral, an extreme example of female thralls' lack of bodily autonomy. Between these extremes, most free women occupied positions that combined significant household authority with clear gender expectations. They were valued for skills in textile production, food preparation, medical knowledge, and child rearing, while also expected to maintain family honour, sometimes by goading male relatives toward violent revenge when that honour was threatened. The archaeological evidence for women's lives comes primarily from grave goods, which show both gender differentiation and significant overlap.